welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Walid Phares. He's a well-known author of many books, including the most recent one on Iran that we'll be discussing in our program. He's a foreign policy expert with a great deal of experience, particularly on the Middle East, and he is a political commentator and pundit as well. He speaks on Newsmax and many other media. Welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you for joining us today. The book that you have written on Iran and U.S. policy concerning Iran couldn't come at a more timely moment, given the ongoing civil unrest in Iran, the ongoing the escalation in Ukraine, in part fueled by Iranian weapons, and of course, U.S. foreign policy, which is trying to balance these security and human rights concerns with the Biden administration priority of achieving a nuclear deal. Now, before we get into these very thorny issues and the themes of your book, I wanted to introduce you a little bit to our audience, which is quite diverse. And if you could tell us about yourself, your previous books, and your experience in this area, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Irina, for this invitation. I am honored to be on your show. I'm honored to be with your diverse audience. Simply, I could summarize it in a very quick way. I had 3 parts of my professional life. The early one was out of Beirut. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon. And I spent most of the 15 years of the Lebanese Civil War living in Lebanon, obtaining all my degrees from St. Joseph University, from the Lebanese University. I became a practicing lawyer, and I published quite a bit, mostly in Arabic at the time, and also some in French, and maybe one essay in English. I had also been engaged with international media, foreign media, even before I immigrated to the United States. So I was well prepared to my second career, which began in 1991 in the United States, when I relocated, emigrated, and I attended school again, obtaining my PhD from the University of Miami on ethnic conflict and strategic studies. During the 90s, very quickly, I published one book, a lot of articles, but I started also to engage in 2 fields that I felt my adopted country and their legislators needed. One is the ethnic conflict in the Middle East and North Africa, and as well as minorities issues. I have been involved in testimonies and panels with the US Senate and some with the US House, and I was also advising on a legislation which became law in 1998 about international religious freedom. So that was before the 3rd benchmark, which was 9/11. After 9/11, many experts in my field, scholars and experts, I taught in Florida at multiple universities, but mostly my teaching house was at Florida Atlantic University in the Palm Beach area. I have been teaching a variety of courses, including those that I am expert in: ethnic conflict, terrorism, human rights, and international politics as well. After 9/11, I moved. I was asked by a foundation, a Washington-based foundation, to move to Washington and to serve as a senior fellow. I've started to give ongoing briefings to members of Congress. And later on, I was hired by NBC as the terrorism expert for 3 years. And then it was followed by my longest career in the media, which was Fox News from 2007 till 2021. That's pretty long with a national TV. I became their foreign policy analyst for all these years. On the political level, as a scholar, I was invited twice by a presidential candidate. I myself am an independent, registered as an independent, but I have advised many presidential campaigns and many members of Congress and the Senate over I would say 27 years. But the two most important events were when Mitt Romney, the Republican presidential candidate in 2011 and 12, asked me to join his foreign policy and national security board. Then again, as most people know from the media, I was also announced by Donald Trump as his first foreign policy advisor in March of 2016, and I served the whole year. In addition to that, there was a very important function I assumed responsibility, and I continue to assume, which is serving as a Secretary General for a bipartisan and actually transatlantic group of legislators, the Transatlantic Parliamentary Group, which started as on counterterrorism, but then it became a group interested in all sorts of geopolitical issues from 2009, technically, till now. In terms of books, I have published a number of books. The most important benchmark books were Future Jihad, Terrorist Strategies Against America and the West, which was probably the best book till now, till this one, and I hope that this one will beat this other book. It was read universally, campuses, national security community, the public on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was followed by a series of books that people could find online. The second most important benchmark was in 2010 when I published a book titled The Coming Revolution, The Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. Now, that was a book that projected most of the Arab upheavals, they called it the Arab Spring, and the civil wars that followed, almost covered the whole decade, the 2010 decade. And I've published also significant number of articles, but let's close it with the coming book in a couple of weeks, which I consider the most complete work I've done on Iran, the regime, we'll talk about it obviously, and US policy. What did the regime do and what was the reaction of US policy? Many things I've done also over the past 32 years, but this is the essence. And I hope that those who are listening or viewing will have an opportunity to look at my work online.
Thank you so much for this survey of very interesting scholarship. Now, the most obvious questions I want to ask is what made you decide to write your next work on Iran, given the multiplicity of threats coming to and from the region in recent years? And it sounds like the plan for your book preceded the breakout of these current protests that started in September with the death of one young Kurdish woman.
Absolutely, Irina. This is the greatest question. I will write about it actually when the book is out. So it will be the first time I'm going to answer it on your show. This is almost has become a tradition with me in publishing. The book Future Jihad I wrote in 2004. That was after the 9/11 Commission or while it was taking place, these hearings. And I projected the jihadi urban explosion, meaning the cells in Europe, in America. And I wrote about what the strategies, not just of Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda and what would become a neo-Al-Qaeda. That was many years before, actually it was 10 years before ISIS. And I don't want to use the term predicted, we don't do it in political science, but projected that there will be waves of jihadists and they will branch out into a variety of organizations. And I looked at the common goal for all these movements and specifically the mental warfare, the war of ideas. So that was one book where I projected, and then those things started to happen. The second one I just mentioned is The Coming Revolution. The only difference is I project them to come a little bit farther in time because I'm an intellectual, but then they come even faster. So my book of 2010, The Coming Revolution, I worked on it years before, maybe 3-4 years. But then immediately after its publication, like few months, 4 months, the Arab Spring exploded. This one has the same pattern. This book on Iran, I drew almost all of my experience. I will tell your audience, I mean, frankly, I was very, very young, but I witnessed the reaction of radical forces. I was first year or second year of law school in Beirut when I was still in the Middle East. And I witnessed the reaction to the revolution or to the coup in Iran, 1979. And from that time, I focused on this issue in addition to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And in 2007, I published my first book on Iran. 1987, I'm sorry about that, in Arabic. And since I emigrated and throughout those 31 years and a half till last September, I have published a lot on analysis of the geopolitical goals of the Iranian regime, but they were parts of books and not a book by itself. I had just one essay published. You can find it on Amazon. So this book was based on this 3 decades or more experience and observation. That's why it's a thick book. Almost it's a history book, but it's easy to read. So my projection was, after I analyzed the 1999 revolution in Iran by students, it was not well known in America because there was no internet or serious internet. Then the 2009 revolution, where Twitter was there and Facebook was there. And then I drew another important observation of that similar uprising, but we didn't hear much about it, of 2019. American politics were busy with, or what we had at the time was the 1 year before the COVID and before, of course, what we witnessed in 2020. So drawing on those three, being in touch with Iranian political exile and, of course, NGOs representing the communities actually inside Iran, I finalized the book. And a little story for your audience. I was planning on having it published early next year. I mean, in January or February, because I had done all that research. The publisher insisted that now that in September we have all these demonstrations, this is going to be the first book and the only book for a long period of time of this size. And then we accepted. So that's the reason why what was projected to be published in 2023 is about to be published now. And what prompted me really is twofold. Number one, in my own experience with all what I have mentioned before, and as an educator, I realized that the American public needed a book, maybe many books, not the only one, by other authors to explain really what happened in Iran, the evolution of that regime. Unfortunately, we'll talk about it. US academia did not do a good job over the past many decades. And second, because government also, people who work in government, in Congress, European Parliament, will have that need to have a different view, which is different from all the analysis that recommended the Iran deal.
Now, one thing worth asking about at this current juncture, and having looked at a very recent history of US foreign policy reactions to Iran, is Iranian policy has been fairly consistent in prioritizing the Islamic Revolution above everything else. There were time periods when Iran was relatively weak after the Islamic Revolution and they had to deal with more local issues, but overall, that has been the trajectory in over 40 years of the current regime's existence. US, by contrast, has vacillated from prioritizing the Cold War impact of battling communism to assorted other issues, to counter-terrorism against jihadists, and now turning back to China and Russia and so forth. So there, the policy towards Iran has never been as consistent as Iran's policy towards the external world. Is there a common thread, however, that you have noted during the entire time, connecting various administrations? Have they really, in your opinion, understood the nature of the Islamic Republic and its goals and agendas?
Irina, I'm happy that you asked this question, but let me begin by describing a little bit of your work and the people like yourself who are serious, strategic, follow on the long run. I mean, you have been among those who precisely summarized it the way you did, which is, on the one hand, the regime has been consistent, has been strategic. Yes, of course, they have crisis to manage. Well, that's what the Soviet Union did. at the same time. I mean, this is a kind of a regime, as you know, which survives only to achieve its long-term ideological and strategic goal and manages the crisis. And the differences, as you know, between the so-called reformists or less reformists, or we call them extremists in Iran, is really about the management, not about the long-term goals or rules. So yes, I can only take what you said and add the following. My historical observation, really, it consumed most of my adult life. Saw there from Khomeini, 79 to 89, then Khamenei, from 89 till now, a consistent strategic path, not only to maintain the Iran regime. That would be like every nationalist regime would do it. They would sacrifice everything, including the well-being of a people, for the maintaining, if you want, of that regime. But they had an expansionist agenda, and they were so patient about it. I mean, first of all, it was about the Iran regime. Then the Iran regime allied itself with the Syrian Ba'athist Alawi Assad regime. It took time. And then from Lebanon, both of them moved as a condominium into Lebanon, created Hezbollah. It's like marching orders, step after step, and controlled Lebanon after a long struggle with the local Lebanese resistance, meaning the anti-Iran, and of course with Israel, all the way to the year 2000. And then they reverted all back to try to control, and they did eventually control Iraq, at least the government, the state. And then I can remember when we started to warn about pay attention to Yemen, because the Houthi militia, which was funded also by the Iranians, trained by Hezbollah, started to manifest itself sometime around 2009. And I'll talk about the foreign policy, the US foreign policy, why these dates correspond to each other. Something major changed in 2009 in America. What was it? A new administration with a different view, a completely different view, the Obama administration, and the view that would lead to the Iran deal. So we see that this is an Iranian regime that consolidates on the inside and that expands and expands and expands. And then, of course, in the world of intelligence and terrorism, this is not just the Middle East. They have been all over the place, in Africa, in Latin America, Venezuela, operations in Europe, in Asia. That's a different story. Now, your question is, while we see the Iran regime being consistent and moving gradually, what did we see in terms of US policy? That is the heart of my book. That is the heart of my book. We saw US policy from the Republicans to the Democrats, back to one and then the other. First, unsure about what to do with Iran, unsure. Even though the toughest of all these administrations was not clear as to what is the solution, what is the ultimate strategy. We could go back, I mean, if you want to discuss the book later, or maybe in other fora later on, the Reagan toughness with Iran, followed by the first Bush administration policy of accepting a status quo with Iran, but not allowing them to expand. And obviously, the Clinton administration, which was neutral in terms of strategic containment, all the way to the Bush administration, which changed the standing with regard to Iran, but was busy with other files as well, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Then came, in my view, the earthquake. And it was a ideological, strategic, economically based, different vision of the Iran regime, mostly influenced and suggested by America's academia. This is the actual policy that influenced the Obama administration. And we know the rest, we could talk about it. It ended up with the Iran deal. Then you have the short 4 years of the Trump administration, where there was an attempt to change it, to change the course of that ship. And then it ended quickly. And now we're back almost to the vision of the Obama administration, but the management of the Biden administration is very different, very difficult. And international crisis and the geopolitical situation in the Middle East is not helping this administration.
Now, would it be fair to say that at no point in U.S. history with the Islamic Republic has there been a policy of dismantling Iranian institutions as opposed to containing or essentially either containing or coexisting with Iran as it is. And
No,
I'm using dismantling Iranian institutions very deliberately to avoid the combination of words regime change, which can mean many different things, but in general means, from US perspective, direct intervention in the overturn
yes.
of the current system. I'm using this combination very deliberately, not regime change.
No, absolutely, Irina. I mean, this is the debate that we had in Washington, and you are a Washington expert. First of all, there is this a fog in the way American foreign policy thought about, processed the thinking about Iran. Somehow, and I blame academia, and to a certain degree, US media, which is influenced by academia. Academia originally proposed that either it's the choice of regime change by Iraq and Afghanistan-like strategies, meaning go in by military force, change the regime, install a new regime. And that's influenced from years of the Cold War, where the US was criticized for going to places, islands and places, and changing this by force. They did not give another alternative. They said either this or, that's academia, you will then have to collaborate with the Iranian regime and consider that this is a regime in transition, and then eventually end up with a Iran deal. It was not the Iran deal that we signed, the US signed, was not the only project. There were many projects. So I did an investigation, historical investigation of why is it that American academia influenced American media, and these two movements left a lot of impact on the government, or meaning some administrations. What was behind that? Well, I'm arguing in the book, and I don't want to let a lot of stuff go out. It has to be read. It's an Iranian strategy, Irina. So it's not only we as Americans thought that this would be the best for us. We were told. We were in a war of ideas. We call it manipulated, maneuvered to think. So what would that? This is very serious. Over the past many years, people were talking about foreign influence. This is the mother of foreign influence, not just with the Islamic Republic of Iran, but also with other Islamist bodies and movements. I mean, they were actually moving into US political space and influencing the thinking of our elite, which became translated into policy. So the mistakes were tremendous. We were told either you are invading and that's immoral, or you have to actually cut a deal, have a partnership with the Iran regime. No one of all the administrations was able to break that influence and say, no, there is something in between, which is to work with the Iranian people. That's what we have done, actually, in different measures with Eastern Europe. That's what we have done in multiple other places around the world. So you work with them. Now, this is not exactly, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this would have been the conclusion of these conflicts had the administrations, all administrations, worked with the actual civil society, which is another subject to discuss. But I agree with your approach.
I want to ask a question about President Obama's administration, which some may find a little bit controversial, but I think this is a good time to delve into a very poorly understood structure, which is that President Obama justified his general policy towards Iran as an attempt to balance Sunni and Shia interests in the Middle East. Now, most people don't really know or understand the difference, but they essentially thought it was the balancing of interests between Iran and Saudi Arabia and left it at that. I've always questioned that definition of that particular phraseology, given the fact that Iran has been quite flexible with its alliances, which ranged from takeover of several states in the area, which Saudi Arabia did not do, to institutional takeover, not formal annexation, to alliances with Muslim Brotherhood, which some people claim to have Sunni affiliations, to its alliance of convenience with groups like Al Qaeda and so forth. So, which is far less true for Sunni states like Saudi Arabia. Their alliances with Shia groups is far less extensive. So when we talk about this balancing of interests that President Obama set forth as his vision for the Middle East, what are we really talking about?
First of all, I make a big distinction between what the policy was, what the narrative was, and some arguments. It's a war of ideas, meaning each political party, domestically or foreign lands, they want to win these conflicts. They want to, be victorious in their agendas. So part of the narrative is used to confuse the other side.
Mm-hmm.
That's war of ideas. I mean, any psychological warfare expert will tell you that there is a difference between what you are actually doing and what you want your foe. It could be a radical foe, national outside the country, or it could be your political foe on the inside. I think the notion that the Obama administration intellectuals and experts used, that what we're doing right now, our rapprochement with Iran, is to create a balance between Sunni and Shia, is not the real thing. Because Iran is not the Shia. Iran's regime is the Khomeinist regime, which are the National Socialists of Iran, and of course, all these radical Shia, Hezbollah, militias. And so the deal that was done with Iran was not with the Iranian people. And evidence now is what the Iranian people is telling us. Why did you consider, they're saying it on social media, why did you consider Iran being the mullah and the ayatollahs and this Islamic Republic? We are Iran, and we see it that the younger and younger generations do not subscribe to this idea. So on the one hand, you have, yes, the administration cut a deal with the Iranian regime, not with the Shia. And there are a lot of Shia opposition to that regime across the Middle East. On the other hand, it was not to balance the Sunni, because the Obama administration cut a deal or so, or almost, with the Muslim Brotherhood, as you just mentioned. And the Muslim Brotherhood do not represent the majority of Sunnis. So what was said to be a balance between Shia and Sunni is in fact a balance between the two types of Islamists within the Shia and within the Sunni, and create some sort of condominium in the Middle East that and a sitting administration can work with. Remember, and during the Cold War, there were previous administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, but for other reasons, have designed the idea that we need to work with the Muslim world, Sunni world, against the Soviet Union. Very noble, very smart. But practically speaking, with whom did they actually work? With mostly Islamists. I mean, the pre-Taliban Mujahideen were not jihadists, but they were Islamists. And of course, across the Arab world, we worked with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this was possible only because some of these Arab countries, including in the Gulf and elsewhere, who were concerned about Soviet and communist expansion, accepted to use the Mujahideen and the Jihadists and the Ikhwan and the Brotherhood as a shield against the communists. That's the reason for why, okay, it was fine. But at that time, those Islamists were focusing on the Soviet Union. And they were fooling the rest of the Arabs. They told them, oh, we are with you, conducting a jihad against the Soviet Union, the atheists, mulhideen, etc. But what they had in mind was different. Bring down the Soviet Union and then turn against these regimes. And this is when the regimes and the governments in the Arab world, which during the Cold War were actually funding these forces, understood that they were the final targets, which explained, and I'm just going from side to side, how the Arab coalition came to exist. It was a frustration with what the Islamists have done in the Arab world. So the UAE and Bahrain and Egypt, the big Egypt and Saudi Arabia realized that and realigned themselves. So my conclusion to your great question is that no, the Obama administration strategy, it's not that they are Islamist filial, like they like the Islamist regime. No, it's they want to use them as instruments of influence for this administration and also for mobilization. President Obama himself, and I wrote it in one of my articles and in this book, coming book, said that the Islamists are the greatest vehicle of mobilization in those areas. He's not an Islamist. He's a progressive. I don't know how left of a progressive, but he's a progressive. So it's like for the woke ideology, it's not about the old traditional left and right or right and left. It's about an instrument of power. And unfortunately, what the Islamists were able to do is to outmaneuver everybody, every political faction in the United States. They did it with the first Bush administration, and they did it also with the Obama administration.
Now, to follow up on that question, starting with George W. Bush, but also especially both Obama and Biden people, a great deal of emphasis has been put on the democracy and support for democracy movements around the world. Needless to say, neither the Muslim Brotherhood nor Khomeini are democratic in any meaningful sense. They will use elections to get to power, but structurally, the Muslim Brotherhood is as hierarchical as the Khomeinis, as we can see from the formal state structure of the Islamic Republic, not to mention a complete lack of any sensible liberalism or real democracy on any level in Iran. I have trouble believing that the Obama administration, with all the access to intelligence agencies and information that it had, did not have a conception of the difference between true democracy as it is practiced in countries with real elections and this cynical use of the process to get completely undemocratic and illiberal groups to power. How then did the administration justify and was able to sell this false vision, first of all, to voting Americans, and second, to the rest of the world that somehow took part in supporting some of the same soft power rhetoric that we're seeing from then to till now?
This is a whole chapter in my book. Thank you for introducing it. I'm very happy to summarize my arguments in this field. First of all, a very important point and sensitive to Americans and to everybody around the world. And I heard it many times. And I had the opportunity to conduct so many seminars and giving classes and lectures to the ensemble of analysts across the intelligence community in the United States, one of my best achievements. I don't want to name the agencies. I've done that for 16, 17 years. And when I teach or give a lecture, the best part that I have is not what I say. It's the questions that comes from the analysts. The analysts are the nerve center of the agencies. It's not the operational side. I'm not interested in the operational side. Just how do they think? Because this pyramid of analysis that goes from the base of the agencies all the way up to the administration gets to the National Security Council and or the other institutions, DOD and etc., and then are translated into those intelligence estimate to a president, a US president. We know US presidents are not PhDs in anything. Some have experience in one field or other, but they're not PhD in everything. I am not a PhD in everything, you as well. So they need to help the help of these agencies. The agencies, the intelligence community brings facts. The problem is, how do you read these facts? It's not about the facts. There are 12 missiles based in Afghanistan. These are 12 missiles based in Afghanistan. I could give you that accurately. But what is on the mind of the Taliban or jihadists so that they would use those 12 missiles? That's where the catastrophe in analysis occurred. Our intelligence community, and again, I'm going to repeat it one more time if you allow me, because of the influence coming from academia, what would be a reference for an analyst sitting in the intelligence community? What other reference that, other than the information that he has from the ground? He's going to contrast this with what he or she learned on campuses. That if you see these signs, meaning Brotherhood or Taliban or Hezbollah and Lebanon accepting the principle of vote, they are on their way to become democratic. That's what you said to us in a different context. Well, no. Look at the model of Mussolini and Hitler. They came after, their regimes came after real democracies that existed in the beginning of the century. Germany had elections, Italy, France, everywhere. And the same goes for the Bolsheviks or the communist parties, but more evident for the fascist parties. So the intelligence communities are excellent, especially the American ones and the British and others, when it comes to collection of data, and then they propose it. Then an academic opinion or analysis will come and present a reading of this analysis. This is why when you ask about these administrations, you have two influences that come here to play. One is from the intelligence community that presents what are the facts and what should be done about it. And then one is the advising body. The advising body, that's why I keep repeating, is influenced in this case of Iran by the Middle East studies elite, those who teach at Harvard and UCLA and, the whole Ivy League, old Ivy League. And there were very good books about it. Castles on the Sand, I guess. And I did some little work on it. And the war of ideas enabled both Brotherhood with their petrodollars and the Iranians and other nationalists from the Middle East to open all these Middle East programs and then help those academics to continue to teach other generations. And as I explained it very clearly, where does a classroom's graduate go? They will go to the newsroom. They will go to the courtroom. They will go to the war room. So I did a long digression just to explain that this idea of democracy, which came to the Obama-Biden team, that's a different story with the Bush team, came from an ideological front. So they thought that whatever that elite told them, that if they vote, meaning they are going democratic, they didn't understand that these totalitarians are using democracy, as you said, to get to power. And once they are in power, they will close this. For the Bush administration, which after 9/11 put forward a movement called Democracy Forward or Freedom Forward, they had an instinct on the issue because many of their advisors were coming from the community that did the struggle against the Soviet Union. And I've met so many, and I was part, but at a much lower level. So yes, they wanted to do democracy in Iraq, and yes, they wanted to do democracy in Afghanistan, but they didn't understand the difference between these societies and Eastern European societies. Eastern European societies have operated a revolutionary change in their mentality, in their doctrine. They have experienced actual liberal democracy. In those countries, if you lift one foe, then you have to deal with the schooling system. You have to wait to have a liberalized society, which we were about to have. Sorry, I'm digressing, but in Afghanistan, after 20 years, yes, it failed because of a decision made here in Washington, but there were enough women and NGOs and teachers and etc. They were about to leap to the final democratic movement, and then we released them back to the medieval times with the Taliban. And same goes everywhere in the region. So they didn't understand that to obtain democracy, it's not the electoral system. So I conclude like yourself. It's an intellectual revolution which was on its way, and now again could come back with this Iran revolution.
Now, there's one interesting point in that the administration has appeared to be far more concerned about Iran's nefarious dealings with Russia, likewise a pseudo-democratic country for many years, which very well understood U.S. thinking on that issue. And we've had things like exceptions to the armament treaties, which has allowed Russia to sell weapons to Iran back in the early 2000s. And we have seen Iran and Russia form a gas cartel in 2008, along with Qatar. And now we are all of a sudden shocked to see that Russia and Iran are cooperating with respect to Ukraine in exchange of weapons and all sorts of, and Russia's been building nuclear reactors for Iran and so on and so forth. This apparent shock for this current Biden administration, nevertheless, would not have been possible had it not for decades of avoiding the growth of relations between Russia and Iran by multiple administrations. How did we really miss that coming?
First of all, we had part of that history as part of the Cold War. So we missed the boat between 1979 and 1991. So there wasn't Iran, but we were busy, of course, with the Soviet Union and how we're going to manage our exit from the Cold War, and everything was focused on what would Gorbachev do and the coup of Moscow. So I would be more merciful in the last decade of the Cold War because the Soviet Union was the threat. Though we could have at that time had the best approaches to the Islamic Republic because it was the weakest possible. The Soviets didn't like the Islamic Republic in the beginning. They had even tensions between themselves. We should have worked along with our allies in the region, but I would say I'll give them a pass. It was the Cold War. Now, after the Cold War is where I would not give them a pass, which is the most important decade was the 90s. It was before 9/11. It was still Russia with Yeltsin. And you know, Yeltsin wanted to join the Western community. The Russian society was rushing to the West for the entertainment, for change of culture. The army, the armed forces were on the one hand put under pressure by Yeltsin, and on the other hand, they didn't have enough time to reorganize their network, which is the military industries and then part of the nationalist part of the army. That happened sometime around 2000 to 2002. And 9/11 actually helped Russia to reorganize itself because if you remember when there were those meetings between President Bush and the new leader of Russia, Putin. So even Bush felt that it's not anymore the communist Russia, it is not the Soviet Union. They were also hit by the jihadists, which is true. The jihadists targeted Russia throughout the 90s and after that. But it lost us, it lost the United States, the ability to link up with the democratic element inside Russia. That is a failure, but that's not our subject. And second, a slow convergence between the new leadership in Russia and the Iran regime. This is where our problem really started. When you have an Iran that would slowly drift to become under the wing of Russia, you're going to translate it into what? Into under the nuclear umbrella of Russia. And add to it later on China. I mean, last year, 2021, signed a formal treaty with Iran. And many here in America, in Washington, don't realize that they're not dealing only with Iran. They're dealing with an Iran that is part of a three-power alliance, four-power alliance with North Korea. So you are right in this point. But I would say the weakness of the Iranian regime has always been its people. Their strength was to deter us from working with their people. This is how they outmaneuvered the West. And then the Iran regime was so smart. These are chess players in releasing into the West a so tempting of a policy, of a project, that it influenced many of our administrations. And you know what it is, it's the Iran deal. If you want next, we could discuss the Iran deal and how Iran did it, which is in my book. But going back to the Russia-Iran, yes, there was a sudden wake up after February by the international community, including by everybody in Washington. Oh my goodness, Iran is sending drones, is producing drones for Russia to use in Ukraine. There was one aspect, and I'll stop my answer here, that many did not pay attention to. And I was asked a question, and I'm answering in the book. What does it mean that Iran will send drones to Russia to use them in Ukraine? Of course, there is the fact that Iran has those factories, which, by the way, were done with the advice of Russia and China. So it's like Russia and China are allocating the build-up of drones in Iran because that money comes from and the technology comes from the two powers. But there is an aspect that escaped many, and I'd like to talk about it quickly in your show. Russia and Iran are playing a sort of a rehearsal for what? For a stage that is coming soon. When Iran will send all these drones to Russia and creates this halo about its role, its aggrandizement there, what it is actually doing is allowing Russia to say, when I was in my darkest hours, which is what's happening right now, the sanctions and all of that, and I am fighting to regain my quote unquote land, Who helped me? Iran's regime helped me. It was so obvious. So what is the price of that? Then Moscow will argue, you Iranian regime helped me during my darkest hours. I'm going to help you during your darkest hours. And what would that mean? It means that Russia, if Iran's regime or its forces are threatened by the West and whomever considers themselves West in the region, then Russia will extend its nuclear umbrella over Iran. So maybe what I'm saying is very serious and stressful. Maybe the first weapons to be deployed in Iran, the nuclear weapons, may not be the product of what they are producing, trying to produce in their factories right now, the nuclear factories. It may be just few tactical nukes deployed in Iran, and even by their allies, could be Russia, China, or North Korea, and say, now we have this coalition, and we're not going to allow neither the United States, nor Europe, nor even Israel to use any of their weapons to deter Iran. That's the big game. And that's the price of leaving Iran, use all that time, the regime, to coalesce with Russia and China.
Now, you mentioned JCPOA as a product sold to the United States by Iranians themselves. And quite frankly, I've always wondered why the US and many others have been so enamored with that particular vision and nuclear deal that would prevent Iran from going nuclear, when it's very obvious that the Iranian regime is not self-destructive. The nuclear deal was always a carrot. It's always relied on conventional arsenal of weapons to far greater degree than the theoretical nuclear deterrent, which many countries already possess anyway, and which it could get from anybody without building its own arsenal, from North Korea, Pakistan, China, and Russia, to name but a few. How is it that everyone has fallen for this obvious trope when there are immediate dangers, the missiles being used widely across the region, threatening US, the abductions, the attempted assassinations that have only increased in time, reaching US soil? There's been a number of individuals ranging from former Trump officials to activists to assorted others who have been in danger of being killed in the US by Iranian assassins. How has this become of lesser importance than the nuclear deterrent?
Also, I want to refer, of course, to the book. There's a whole chapter and a half on what is the genesis of the Iran deal, of that offer that was made by the Iranian regime, all the governments, but mostly after 2003 and 4. And it's a very rich chapter. And what attracted basically the Obama administration, because they made that offer to the Bush administration and they didn't buy this. They made a lot of mistakes, but not that one. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we saw what happened with the Trump administration. It just withdrew from the deal. But so the real question is, what's behind it? As you said earlier, a few minutes ago, some argued in that administration, the Obama administration, that this was about working with the Iranians to have a balance between them and the Sunnis. We realize it's not the case. Others said from the same camp that an Iran deal is done because if we bring Iran to a level, socioeconomic level, that the middle class there, which is foundation of the regime, will feel comfortable. I call it the most naive explanation. They will start moving towards the West and the market economy, and they'll be cool.
That's because it works with China, by the way. So why would it work with Iran?
You answered it already. Now, here's the deal. Here's what I think is behind it. Only if you understand the American system and how it works, and you and I both lived through it. In America, financial and economic influence is overwhelming in the decision-making. I mean, when I was in the Middle East, much younger years, and I would hear all these critics saying, oh, it's all about money, I'll say, oh, you're going too far. In fact, it is, in a sense. Of course, there are values like our freedom, our sovereignty, being our public is very sensitive to human rights issues around the world. All of that, absolutely. But then you have what we call the lobbies. The lobbies in America are known to have a excessive influence on the decision-making process of administrations, of Congress first, and of administration. So here's the discovery that was done. In the genesis of the Iran deal, it was a deal not with the administration. It was a deal between the regime of Iran through a very complex system, which I'll explain in my book, to get to whom? To the economic part of the economic financial elite here, companies. And those companies, they don't have political intentions or objective. What is their objective? To make money. And they would do it with any other power around the world, not just with Iran. So the first link was between the regime and the companies. And the offer was, you help us get out of this isolation to break those sanctions. And you could use, all the influence that you have, and we will allow you, we will actually open our market for you. And any country that is coming out of very difficult circumstances is ideal for reconstruction. Ideal for reconstruction. Any oil-producing, gas-producing country like Iran is like the El Dorado for a financial interest. That's why the Europeans ran so fast towards the Iran deal. So Europeans talk more than the United States about human rights, but they were the fastest going into the Iran deal, and they signed it. In America, obviously, you have a resistance to that. You have a resistance to dealing with Iran because of our history with them. But that, I call it now, not the Iran deal, not the Iran lobby, which is representative of Iranian Islamic Republic, and it's pretty much small in size. It's the Iran deal lobby. The Iran deal lobby is much wider than the actual Iran lobby of the regime. It's a conglomerate of financial interest in America who are putting pressure on all administrations, specifically on the Obama and on the Biden administrations, to have them sign the deal so that they could make profit, these conglomeration of financial interest. I refuse in my book to go into an investigation of that matter because that's Congress that will have to do it. But clearly, any political scientist, any analyst will realize what are those entities and companies who would want to enter that market, and not just the Iranian market. Through Iran, they will enter through the Iraqi market. They will enter through the Syrian market. And of course, Lebanon. Didn't we witness about a few weeks ago the deal, the gas deal? Well, it's the same direction. These are international companies who are ready to do anything. They don't care about the national security of anybody, not Israel, not the Arabs, or the freedom of the Lebanese. They cut the deal with Hezbollah. That is part of that new approach that convinced many administrations, I would say 2 administrations, and specifically the Obama administration, that this is the right choice to be done. It's lobbying.
Unfortunately, the 2 years of the Republican Congress under Trump have failed to produce any such investigations. One hopes that people will learn from that mistake in the future. But that brings me to the issue of the Iranian people, which you have referenced several times quite correctly. For all the talk about democracy and liberalization and improving the conditions for the Iranian people, we have seen that during the active years of the JCPOA, none of that money has actually improved anyone's life, which is why today's protests don't even mention the return to the deal or the desire. Much as some people like to spin it, that is not mentioned anywhere, and every other cause is mentioned except for the JCPOA. It has not actually benefited the Iranian people in any way. If anything, it actually made things worse, which is why we have seen increase in protests since that time. Now, today we are seeing a very prolonged and extensive period of civil unrest, including in particular in the Kurdish region. One might say that the numbers may be smaller than the 2019 events, but the protests are longer and they are certainly capturing more headlines. How would you explain that? Why the difference? Why are they longer now? And why is there more attention being paid by the media, which, by the way, seems to have not made any impact on the Biden administration, despite even Washington Post reporting on this issue?
All right, so remember that the Iran deal lobby and the Iran lobby, both of them, have had so much influence in our media. You mentioned Washington Post, New York Times, the LA Times, and then the second more radical level, Mother Jones and the Daily Beast, and all that world that is called at times mainstream, but in fact it was at the time, the apologist media for the Iran deal. They were pushing for the deal to preserve the deal and attacking the critics of the deal. One of the major reasons, not all of the reasons, for this harsh attacks against the previous administration, obviously you have domestic reasons, but one of the reasons was that Trump removed the US from the deal. They went berserk. There was a pressure by these lobbies on the media, and American media, to go after the previous administration, not just on all the other grounds, which are domestic, but one of the grounds was the Iran deal. How did he do that? And when the US eliminated Soleimani, if you recall, Soleimani was like bin Laden and like the other leaders. When Obama ordered the elimination of bin Laden, it was a euphoria. I mean, everybody in America, the Republicans and Democrats, they cheered. But when the administration in 2020 eliminated Soleimani, it's not just a symbolic, because Soleimani was ordering the targeting of Americans. And throughout the Iraq campaign, 700 American servicemen and servicewomen were targeted by his militia. Bottom line is that the influence by the American media on the influence of the Iran deal lobby on the American media was extensive. Now, what happened recently is creating a crisis. We are in the middle of a crisis whereby in the West, the supporters of the Iran deal, meaning apologizing for the Iran deal, not really supporting the Iranian opposition, removing it from the agenda, everything you mentioned right now, they're experiencing a crisis. And that's the essence of your question. What happened really in between? What happened in between, first of all, the growth of the Iranian opposition, self-awareness, the sophistication. It takes time. Any opposition in the world may, in the first few years of its life, be very weak, very dispersed, etc. Now you see an intelligence brain or multiple brains behind what's happening in Iran. And you noted it very clearly. Instead of a big, large demonstration, these are micro demonstrations across the nation. You cannot beat them. Second reason, and I'm summarizing here, is technology. Technology has now become, it's the advantage of the Iran regime, drones and radars and what have you, and spies, but it's also a disadvantage. It's internet. There's this whole debate about Twitter now and Elon Musk, and this is the new era where the Iran regime has been trying to shut down the power of social media in the Iranian protests. And guess why they are not able to do it? They are not able to do it because the Iranian economy is based on internet, and they cannot cut a piece of it and not cut the other piece. So now they are facing their own product of using these electronic means for their improvement, and then those bright, small, young teenagers. That's why we see a lot of teenagers, boys and girls, using this technology. So the Iranian revolution now is different from its predecessors. Number one, because technology allows it. Number two, they don't believe in us anymore. They don't believe in the West. They don't believe in US policy helping them. They said, we're going to do it ourselves. If you help us, fine. If you don't help us, well, we're going to be on our own. And more importantly, at this point in time, is that the Iranian youth understood what's happening worldwide in the youth, that the only way to change and be in good steps with the West and the world is to do it themselves. So what you see right now is something that is not going to be reversed. And I conclude with this. It doesn't matter for them how long it's going to take. We in the West are more monarchist than the Iranians themselves. When are they going to change? They're cool about it. They're saying it's going to take us 100 years, we'll do it. But this regime is not going back. It's not going to convince us. And that is creating this indecision among all these financial partners around the world. They're saying, their advisors are telling them, we don't know if our contract with this regime are going to survive. That's the biggest issue.
I want to conclude with a big kind of question. As far as I see from the point of the regional issues, there are four major obstacles to a significant to ending the Islamic Revolution project, as we see. One, the fact that despite its potency, the opposition is very much divided and does not have clear leaderships. There's a lot of infighting between various groups, the monarchists and the Republicans, and both of them against various ethnic minorities, and all sorts of arguments and debates that are not seeing a constructive method, and which regime has really successfully utilized to its own advantage by infiltrating them, manipulating them, increasing tensions, and so forth. Second, the fact that the bureaucracies depend on a significant portion of the population, and the population, without a clear move forward, without a clear federalized plan for continuity, many people simply will not walk away from the military, from the various agencies, from even the private sector is dependent on the regime. So that, and some of it is heavily dependent on particular ethnicities, by the way, disproportionately so. So without those groups moving away, the regime is simply not going to collapse, especially given that it has the power, the tanks, the missiles and so forth, which the people do not. The third factor, as far as I see it, is the fact that the regime is not just Tehran and not just IRGC and the Basiji. It is all the proxies it has accumulated throughout the region, plus its state backers such as Russia, China, and North Korea, who are committed to the survival of this particular regime. So the fourth obstacle is indirect. It's that I don't see any prospective presidential candidates on either side projecting any sort of a plan either to overcome these particular difficulties or in general even roll back Iranian influence throughout the world. Even from the not even from the perspective of regime change, but their own security self-interest. I haven't seen anyone articulate what they would do other than maybe reimpose sanctions and not engage as much, which is, was the Trump strategy and which did not really fully work. It just minimized some of the damage and put some stress, but wasn't nearly sufficient. Based on these arguments that I've presented, what is your projection of U.S. policy and as well as the regional dynamic to respond to this challenge? How do we overcome all of this and move things forward in a better direction? I'm not saying a complete collapse, but a better direction.
Irina, in my book, I have a modest policy suggestion at the end, a series of suggestions that are good for this House, the new House, Congress. Hopefully, as you said, in 2 years, there was not enough time or even ideas. I hope in the next 2 years, in these coming 2 years, there will be some leadership in the House and the Congress that would push in that direction. So that's number one. Number two, my assessment of the weakness of the revolution right now is similar to yours. But let me make a distinction between the two types of weaknesses. One is really an American weakness, strategic weakness. That is another answer to why you and I are having these conversations and I publish and publish, etc. So we need a massive work of education and information for the American public, American Congress, and eventually for the American administration. And as you said, exactly, even under the two administrations, and I wrote it in my book, but in details, there was no real Iran plan. The two administrations that really wanted to weaken the Islamic Republic, who are they? Bush and Trump, regardless of how you compare them. But they both took action, serious action, including the Trump administration, designating the Pasdaran and all of that. But I observed it very closely. There was no Iran plan beyond the maximum pressures. And I always argue from within the same circle, fantastic that there is a maximum pressure, but what comes after maximum pressure? We were not able to see it. Is the idea maximum pressure and then they will collapse and then who comes? You just raise the issue. They're not even organized. So that's on the one hand. Obviously, the Obama and Biden teams are going into a different direction. So I'm not worried about that because they're not going to help any revolution. They're going to be, in the different direction. Now, there is also a weakness in the Iran revolution. This increasingly intense infighting between the factions, you just named all these factions, is not helpful. But this is reality. These are the political factions of Iran on the inside and in the diaspora. So my answer to you is what I can predict. I don't have policies to suggest now in this show because we need decision makers in America and in Europe to be on board for the principle of making a change in Iran. As long as they're not on board, and we cannot make that determination. If the next House or the next European Parliament say, oh, okay, now we understand there is a revolution, we're going to help them, then we will come and say, well, this is the best way. Now we are in this transition between the two. But the Iranian base right now seems to be, in my vision, a bottom-up revolution. It used to be a top-down. Even the Green Revolution was based on what? On those candidates who failed the elections or were failed. Remember, the Green Revolution is about Mousavi, and now it's different. Nobody sees the leaders, which is better. It's a leaderless movement. You cannot eliminate the leadership. Some of the leaders are outside in exile. I mean, those are going to continue to work. They will play a tremendous role. Now, it is all going to depend on if this wave, it's a wave that we see, and it's very short. September to now in the history of revolutions is short. If this wave, despite the divisions among its factions, will be taken by the dynamics of the revolution and forget about it, meaning 99% of the time that we see right now is everybody is together. And as you said, the ethnic minorities are working together. This is the ideal situation. If they push and push and push and create the change, then we're going to witness, it's not going to be Sweden, it's not going to be New Zealand, it's going to be another transitional republic for a while until they settle their own democracy. But that I'm not worried about. It's up to the Iranians to decide. It's up to them to decide what kind of republic they want, who elections. But the only worry I have as a supporter of democracy in the Middle East and as an American is to make sure that this wave continues till a change is made.
But one of the concerns in the European Union in particular, but also the US has always had on this subject, is the possibility of a civil war and territorial infighting that could lead to refugee crisis specifically and other crises in the Middle East in general as a result of this. Do I think that's necessarily the worst possible outcome? I do not for my own reasons, but many people do for their reasons and understandable reasons. So the question is, do we not perhaps see this hesitation to actively support the integration of the opposition voices precisely because nobody really necessarily wants them to fully succeed out of fear of the results of that success?
Absolutely. See, this is an argument, I'm used to it for years now, produced by the Iranian propaganda. So what they do, they come to the politicians through their academic connection, etc., and say, oh no, it's better to have an Islamic republic that is unified, settled, no war. You could do business with them. You could cut a deal. That's the genesis of the Iran deal. Yes, they're abusing human rights. I mean, so what? There are a lot of authoritarians that will come along and become slowly in business with us. That's one argument. The first is they describe to them, it's like remember the previous argument of war or collaboration. Here also, oh, otherwise there will be civil wars. Civil wars meaning refugees. This is totally, in my view, an Iran regime elite argument. What would happen in reality may not be determined by what these elites are telling us, because the Iranians are smart. They're not going to go in a full-fledged civil war just because, they have freed themselves from the mullah. What most likely will happen And it depends. This is why American role leadership is crucial, and European as well. And the help of the Arab world and Israel, all of that could help shepherd the Iranian opposition into getting to a stable point. That is not going to eliminate the political clash inside Iran. No, I mean, we have a deep political clash in America, which is very troublesome. So the Iranians are, if they can get rid of the regime with their own, or if it collapses in one shape or another, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to immediately try to create a transitional government. They're going to negotiate. They're going to say, no, you will have more seats. I'll have more seats. That's number one. They will get a transitional government. And I guarantee you, Irina, that the international community will run immediately and rush to help them form the government for those reasons. It's not that we're going to abandon them. We're going to rush. So that's number one, a change in the West. And second, ethnic communities. It looks like these analysts don't understand there is a new generation in these ethnic communities. See, after the killing of Mahsa Amini, what happened? Iranian youth, Persians, Kurds, Baluch, Azeris, were all coming together. We are seeing it on social media. This is not the old Iran opposition of Iran, where you have neo-Marxists and supporters of the Shah and all wanted to kill each other. No, it's not true. The majority of the youth who did this revolution have nothing to do with extreme politicization. I am very positive at thinking that if that regime collapses, it depends how it will collapse, or it will change, or it would go into a, how we call it, an interim government. Is going to be different from these projections.
Well, it would be wise to consider different possibilities and to weigh them carefully, but the best way to avoid any sort of disaster is to help manage it.
Yes.
That's in my view, and I think anyone with with sufficient foresight will see that just as much. But so far, again, I'm extremely troubled and concerned by the lack of long-term vision among politicians. I guess that should not be that surprising, but when you have an adversary that does think very long-term, and when we cannot think past one term of presidency, that is not a good political and survival balance of the equation here between us and these regimes. So I am hoping that will start to shift as we get closer to 2024, but in the meantime, I hope the future generation of politicians will watch this program and start thinking about it.
If you may, give me 1 minute, one additional extra minute to
Sure,
say
please,
this.
please.
Because this conversation is probably the best I had in a long time. So my observation, not just of the Middle East and the Iran people, but of our politics, is that there is a lot of pragmatism. I can guarantee your viewers that if the push in Iran gets to where they want to go, just the beginning of that second stage, what's going to happen here? Who's going to go and fight for the dissolved mullah regime? Nobody. They're going to all rush to help Iran and the Iranians and make business. The best Iran deal, let me make it into a slogan, will be after the Ayatollah are gone. The same deal they want to do will be done with the bourgeoisie and the industrialists and the middle class of Iran. So let's not be afraid of a post-Islamic republic. Actually, that's the beginning where every force in America, including the Democratic Party, which was reticent, and of course the Republican Party, they will all go to do business in Iran.
It's interesting that you made this point because I have had significant conversations with economic experts, all of whom said that ultimately the deals being cut by businesses with the Islamic Republic now benefit mostly a very small portion of companies that are mostly connected to the Ayatollahs and nobody else, not even their own internal Iranian companies, and certainly not the Western companies, which due to one, endemic corruption, two, business risks, and three, significant costs of doing business and getting around sanctions and dealing with uncertainty and just having all sorts of other practical and logistical problems. So I'm actually quite curious why all of these people feel so invested into something that can be nationalized and taken away at any minute, as has happened repeatedly in undemocratic regimes.
That's the conclusion that experts in the field and conversations like these should get to the desks of decision makers. What are you doing? Especially the government. The companies will always adapt to anything, but the governments making their decisions based on the direct interest of these companies, they're making decisions for the entire American people, not for these companies. And the impact of our decisions in America on the region, this is like difference between one era and another. And look what happened in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, I have a different reading, and we don't want to delve into it, but this matter of lands and etc. should have been solved in 1992, 1993. And you know more than others that if you don't resolve a matter now, we'll have to pay the price for it in wars and conflicts. But
Absolutely.
I'll stop here.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that that we can learn from our mistakes going forward and have conversations that are more productive, more interesting, more diverse, and less dependent on a small group of corrupt lobby-linked interests. That's the best we can hope for here.
Let's hope so.
Thank you so much for joining the Washington Outsider Report. To those watching the program, this was Walid Phares. We were discussing his upcoming book on Iran and on U.S. foreign policy. My name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. And if this is your first program, please join us next week, same time, Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much.